You tell your child not to touch the stove. They touch it anyway. You explain what happens. They do it again. You take away the screen time. Nothing changes. You sit down, look them in the eyes, and wonder, is something wrong with my kid? The answer is not what you think. Because the real reason some children never seem to learn from consequences has nothing to do with stubbornness, defiance, or bad parenting. It goes much deeper than that. It lives inside the developing brain itself, and once you see it, the way you respond to your child will never be the same. Here's what most parents do not know. Consequences, as we understand them, only work when a very specific part of the brain is switched on. That part is called the prefrontal cortex. It sits right behind your forehead. It handles planning, cause and effect thinking, impulse control, and the ability to connect a present action to a future outcome. Without it, consequences are just noise. And in children, the prefrontal cortex is not finished building. Not even close. Neuroscientist Sarah Jane Blakemore, one of the world's leading researchers on the adolescent brain, has shown through decades of neuroimaging studies that the prefrontal cortex does not reach full maturity until the mid-20s. In young children, between ages 3 and 8, this region is so underdeveloped that it is essentially offline for the kinds of complex thinking adults take for granted. A 4-year-old is not choosing to ignore the lesson. Their brain physically cannot hold the lesson the way yours can. But that still does not explain everything. Because some 8-year-olds seem fine. And some 12-year-olds still cannot learn from a consequence no matter how many times it repeats. So what is actually going on? The answer involves something called the dopamine system. Your brain runs on a currency called dopamine. It is a neurotransmitter, a chemical messenger, and one of its most powerful functions is teaching you what to do again and what to avoid. When something goes well, dopamine surges. Your brain marks that action as worth repeating. When something ends in pain or loss, dopamine dips. Your brain files that under danger, stop, do not do this again. This is how consequences are supposed to work. The punishment creates a dip. The dip teaches the lesson. But here is the problem. In many children, especially younger children, and especially children whose brains are wired differently, the dopamine system responds far more powerfully to immediate reward than to future consequence. Psychologist Walter Mischel, famous for the Stanford marshmallow experiment, spent decades studying this tension between immediate pleasure and delayed reward. His work revealed something that no parent should miss: the ability to override immediate impulse in favor of a future outcome is not a moral trait. It is a neurological one. And it develops unevenly, and slowly, across childhood. So when your child grabs the toy they were told not to touch, or lies about the homework they were supposed to do, or repeats the exact same behavior that earned them a punishment last Tuesday, they are not failing morally. They are failing neurologically. Their dopamine system is spiking for the immediate thrill. The future consequence is too far away for their brain to feel it as real. Now add something else to this picture. Stress. When a child is scared, anxious, overwhelmed, or in the middle of being disciplined, the brain floods with stress hormones, primarily cortisol. Cortisol is a powerful chemical. It narrows attention. It forces the brain into survival mode. And critically, it shuts down access to the prefrontal cortex almost entirely. Think about what that means. The moment you raise your voice, the moment consequences are delivered in anger or fear, the moment the child is overwhelmed, the very part of the brain that could learn from the consequence goes offline. Neuroscientist Bruce Perry, who has spent 30 years studying childhood stress and the developing brain, found that children in a state of threat or fear literally cannot access higher cognitive function. They are running on the brain's alarm system, what Perry calls the survival brain, not the thinking brain. And the survival brain cannot connect today's action to tomorrow's outcome. You cannot punish a survival brain into learning. The biology will not allow it. So what does work? And why do some children seem to learn faster, while others seem completely immune? Part of the answer is temperament. Some children are born with a more reactive stress response. Their brains escalate faster and take longer to calm down. Researchers call this heightened stress reactivity, and it has been linked to genetics, early childhood environment, and early attachment experiences. For these children, consequences delivered in moments of high emotion are almost completely wasted, not because they do not care, but because the neurological window for learning is already closed by the time the consequence lands. There is also a concept developmental psychologist Ross Greene has built an entire clinical model around, the idea that children who struggle with consequences are not kids who will not comply, but kids who cannot comply in that moment. Greene's research, and the evidence-based approach he calls collaborative problem solving, demonstrates consistently that children who appear resistant to consequences are almost always lagging in specific cognitive skills, flexibility, frustration tolerance, or the ability to think through problems. These are not attitude problems. These are brain skill deficits. And they respond to very different strategies than traditional punishment. That distinction matters more than almost anything else a parent can hear. Here is where the science gets genuinely hopeful. The brain is not fixed. The prefrontal cortex, while slow to develop, is profoundly shaped by experience. It grows in response to practice, specifically, the practice of making decisions, reflecting on outcomes, and solving problems in calm, supported conditions. Every time a child is walked through the logic of what happened, not lectured, not punished, but genuinely helped to think it through, the prefrontal cortex gets stronger. Neural pathways thicken. The connection between action and outcome becomes more accessible. Psychologist Adele Diamond, whose research on executive function has transformed how scientists understand childhood development, has shown that children build cause-and-effect reasoning not through fear of punishment but through safe, repeated practice of decision-making. Games. Conversations. Low-stakes choices with real but manageable outcomes. The brain builds the skill in calm moments. It retrieves the skill in difficult ones. So the child who never seems to learn is not broken. Their brain is building. It is just building slowly, unevenly, or under conditions that are making it harder than it needs to be. What you do in the calm matters more than what you do in the crisis. When the behavior happens, take a breath. Not because you are not frustrated, but because your frustration will shut down the very brain that needs to be open. Wait until the storm passes, yours and theirs. Then sit down together. Ask what happened, not what they were thinking, because a child under stress does not know what they were thinking. Ask what happened before. Ask what they felt. Walk backward through the moment with them in a voice that does not carry danger. This is not letting them off the hook. This is how the brain learns. This is how the prefrontal cortex gets built. This is how a child who never seemed to learn from consequences becomes a teenager who finally can. The stove is still hot. Nothing about the consequence changed. But the brain receiving the lesson finally has the tools to hold it. And here is the thing you need to hear most. The parent sitting across from a child who never seems to learn is not failing. They are raising a brain that is still being built, in real time, one conversation at a time. The science does not ask you to be perfect. It asks you to be present, regulated, and willing to teach when the brain is open. Because that is the only moment learning can happen at all. You started by wondering if something was wrong with your child. The answer is no. Something is still growing. And it needs time, calm, and you, far more than it needs consequences alone.